Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, Lauren.
Great. Awesome. Hola a todos. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you're having a good day. My name is Nicole Alfaro Núñez, though here in the US I go by Lauren. I'm 23 years old and I am from Costa Rica. I use she, her pronouns. I'd like to say thank you to MFA Program Director Sarah Peterson, previous Director Ellen Mueller, Administrative Assistant Kylie Van Noot, my thesis committee members Nancy Ariza and Edson Rosas, my mentor Russ White, my MFA professors and cohort, y a mi familia y amigues, que sin ustedes no estaría aquí. Muchas gracias. I'd like to begin by telling you about my pictographic language, which I started developing as a kid after some of my friends read my diary, discouraging me from writing anymore. But I was always very curious and observant and wanted to document my memories still. So I began drawing my experiences in a code, transforming the outline of everything around me, narrating stories, allowing me to share them while maintaining the privacy in the writing. My compositions are highly detailed and densely cover up any surface. When I begin drawing, it's like a river's flow of figures. Once I started my undergraduate degree is when I even considered this to be art. The role of my pictographs in my life has changed since I moved away from Costa Rica 8 years ago. I left by myself to begin my journey studying abroad. To the left of the screen, you see a photo of the first time I left in the airport with some of my family members, and in the right photo, you see almost all of my family the last time we saw each other about a year ago. You might not be able to tell because of our smiles, but most of us were crying a little. When I first moved, I didn't speak English, and to be quite honest, I was not aware at all of how deeply migration would affect my life, which we will talk about more in a second. But my pictographs are still my diary. They're now also just where I rest from translation and from panic about forgetting words in Spanish and from expectations to explain myself. I'm always taking mental pictures, but I've opted for some digital photos to remember better the things that I want to write about. Especially in grad school, when there are a lot of things going on at once, it's helpful to reference a photo that will sort of unravel a whole list of observations. And when I've moved in the past, I've been resistant to connecting to my surroundings. So this practice allows me to recognize where I am and to be fully present. So far I've shown you some of my daily drawings, but I keep practices such as painting monthly autorretratos, and I'm always working on some sort of printmaking project at the same time. These processes are an aid for me as I navigate my life. I connect with myself in such a way that I find clarity and wisdom through being focused on making, but they're also the root of my installations, which is the work that I normally share with an audience. This piece is named after these very sharp curves in a street that you drive through to get to my little town in Costa Rica, La Vuelta del Quemal. My mom says you can see your back as you turn. Driving through these curves is a moment of code switching for me, not only language-wise, but in the entire way of living. It's also what I associate with a welcome and a see you soon, since it's the road that I take to go to or come back from the airport. I created this tunnel of fabric to honor that threshold and in-betweenness. I go back and forth between Costa Rica and the US in English and Spanish a lot as I work. I recently read an article that really resonated with me. It states, speaking different languages comes down to having within one's reach several worlds that can be compared to one another. Language is not simply a means of communication, it is also culture, a world of phrases and rhythms that differ. I describe my getting to North America like being dropped in water and submerged in this new world, community, and culture, and there's truly no way to put pause on this reality, even though it gets difficult to always meet the expectation to act according to a reality that you're not used to. So I work to create immersive experiences where I can escape for a little bit, but also others can experience being submerged in something that they don't know. As I think about my installations, Sammy is an artist whose work I look to often. Her latest shows, such as In Transition, feature suspended works with vibrant color contrasts and incredibly detailed imagery cut out on paper or wool, showing houses, floor plans, and natural elements. She states that she explores the reality of finding ideal home and ideal body, residing within global locations, and finally through American norms as she resides in West Texas. As I've migrated, I've expressed only being able to experiment a half or a quarter of the entirety of my life at a time. And one of the things that I appreciate most about Yu's art is that, to me, she's bringing these pieces together through this inclusive composition of figures and embracing exactly that. I have alluded to this division of life or multiplicity of lives in works such as Cycles of Impermanence. This installation consists of an addition of 55 woodcut prints arranged in a grid. I use 7 wood blocks to print a unique piece every time, varying in tone, layer order, and amount of layers as well. The border contains the flow of figures and compartmentalizes the information. Creating these breaks throughout, I'm referencing the halves and quarters, los pedacitos de vida. In this work, I also continue alluding to submersion through scale, and I use color as further reference to submersion in water. One of the things that I noticed as I migrated is that in Costa Rica, I'm used to a slower paced life, possibly partly because I'm from a tiny mountain trap town, but there is an immense difference when compared to my life here. So I became interested in finding ways to provide a moment to slow down through exploration. As a tactile window, I began placing my sketchbooks in my installations, available for anyone to stop by and take a look at my drawings and some writing as well. In my most recent installation, Puntos de Conversación, I created multiple points of interaction to slow down the pace even further and allow for various individual explorations in the same piece. I used my sketchbook, and I also incorporated some fabric pieces hanging from one of the walls, each fabric with a different pattern and bunched up together to invite the audience to explore them too. My interest in fabric begins with the memory of playing with my mom's fabric piles growing up. She was a seamstress while I lived with her, and I always explored her fabric library very rigorously. I love to pick up fabrics to play with, judging by pattern and feel. Wrapping myself in them provided the sense of safety. And I learned a lot from her and all the women in my life who all have the knowledge of this medium. When I choose to work with any sewing process or fabric, it's guaranteed that I will call my mom multiple times in all stages of production. That was the case with La Vuelta del Quemado, which is the first installation piece I showed you, and her calls at a distance couldn't have been more comforting and helpful. Credit to her for helping me accomplish my vision. So, as you can see, my work has become slowly a refuge for me, especially in the midst of traveling and knowing new realities. Just like a piece of fabric holds its threads, my pictographs sew together my reality. I wrap myself in them to grasp onto something in this impermanence. I mean, like I just mentioned, some projects even give me an excuse to call my mom. Making is a gateway home and yet a direct demand to focus on the present. It's also a space for reflection and an especially significant step for me in knowing new environments and remembering old ones. I subtly involve people with the things I'm understanding and processing about my migratory journey as I invite them to enter my work, hoping to create an experience about presence and understanding that the unknown and different isn't against us, it's rather an opportunity to learn. I'll end my presentation with a quote that I adore by Bell Hooks. I suggest that we do not necessarily need to hear and know what it is stated in its entirety, that we do not need to master or conquer the narrative as a whole, that we may know in fragments. I suggest that we may learn from spaces of silence as well as spaces of speech, that in the patient act of listening to another tongue, we may subvert the culture of capitalist frenzy and consumption that demands all desire must be satisfied immediately, or we may disrupt that cultural imperialism that suggests one is worthy of being heard only if one speaks standard English. Muchas gracias y que tengan una hermosa tarde.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fantastic. It's great to hear you speak about your voice, or your work. I would like to open it up to questions. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Okay, so Nick has put in the chat, great presentation, Lauren. Thank you. I'm wondering, did you sense a change in your pictographs as you learned a new language, or do they exist outside of spoken language?
They exist outside of spoken language, though I have to say, they're, like I mentioned, it's like this net connecting all of these things, whether it's things around me or even things that I just think about. So sometimes I'll write in pictographs actual language. So, I didn't feel a specific change when I started learning another language, but definitely there is an influence that comes with it. Thank you for asking.
Any other questions that folks here have for Lauren? Yvonne is asking, did I notice a lot of your pieces talking about water? Which role has this element in your practice?
Yes, so I actually was a swimmer for about 6 to 7 years before I migrated. And I was a competitive swimmer. So I spent most of my day in the pool training. And so water just became kind of like where I rested from a lot of the world, and I think that's why I keep going back to these like water related metaphors in my work and when I talk about it, because I keep connecting kind of like that sense of like a break and a space from the world with water.
That's great.
Thank you for your question. Thanks.
Okay, we've got Kevin asking, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Does anyone know your iconography other than you?
Not necessarily, but one of my favorite things about my like having installations and having people come in and kind of being with them is that they'll start to realize, oh, is that, I don't know, an apple, or is that a house? And then they realize they can start kind of figuring it out. And as the more that you stay there, the more that you're able to kind of bring up these connections with the things that are around and the elements and the marks and how they're connected. So no one will know necessarily the stories that I'm telling specifically, but there's certainly a certain connections you can start making. Thank you for your question.
Anne is asking, I love the scale difference you are exploring. Can you talk about scaling your work for a moment?
Yes. So scale came when I started, or I would say like the biggest change in scale came when I started making installations. So I wanted kind of a more approachable first look at the pictographs where people could begin to recognize maybe that there's some sort of storytelling going on or narrative going on. But one of the things I also really love about placing my sketchbook in is that you can have that intimacy that it brings, and you get to get really close to it and see the tiny little marks. So it creates these two different experiences that I try to bring together to provide to, both kinds of people, or like people who want to experience both, the option.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you for all your responses, and thank you for all the questions. We apologize for not being able to get to all of them. As Ziba has stated in the chat, we will make sure the students do get all those questions because they're great. Wonderful job, Lauren. It was great to hear from you again.
Thank you so much.
And best of luck with everything.